They were once sons of the Imperium, warriors forged in the crucible of endless war, their oaths sworn upon the Emperor's name, their banners gilded with the Aquila's light. For centuries, they bled across nameless stars, their bolters thundering, their chains words roaring, each battle another hymn of loyalty to Terra. Yet history is merciless, and faith is fragile when tested against the abyss. A single fracture in the armor of duty can spread like rust across ceramite, consuming what once seemed indestructible. So it was that a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, sworn guardians of humanity, began to turn from the Emperor's light. Not with thunderous rebellion, nor with the brazen corruption of chaos at first, but with whispers, doubts, and decisions that seemed righteous in their moment. This is their story, a tale not of heroes or villains, but of what becomes of the Emperor's angels when oaths are broken and destiny twists into damnation. It is a story written in silence, in blood, and in the cold indifference of the void. Before we descend fully into their cursed fate, I'll ask only this. If you find yourself drawn deeper into the grim darkness of this tale, then lend your support to the channel. Share this story, strike the icon of the Aquila with a like, and subscribe so more may hear these echoes of forgotten warriors. Your voice, like theirs, becomes part of this eternal war. The records of their beginnings are shrouded in both secrecy and reverence, as is often the way with the Adeptus Astartes. Each chapter is born from bloodlines older than empires, their gene seed drawn from primarchs whose names echo like thunder across history. Theirs was no different, though their progenitor's identity was veiled by the deliberate obscurity of the administratum. Whispers in the reclusium spoke of a lineage tied to one of the more steadfast legions, a bloodline of iron will and unyielding endurance, chosen not for brilliance or cunning, but for sheer, immovable loyalty. It was loyalty that defined their creation, loyalty that gave them purpose. From the moment of their founding, the chapter bore themselves with a pride both solemn and unshakable. Their fortress monastery clung to the jagged cliffs of a storm-wracked world, its battlements battered by winds that never ceased. Recruits were taken from the hardy tribes who lived amidst that world's tempests, youths who knew from birth that to live was to endure. Those who survived the transformation into Astartes emerged not only stronger but bound to one another as brothers forged in suffering. For them, pain was a teacher, and the Emperor's word was law. In their earliest campaigns they were a sight to behold, their banners unfurled beneath alien suns, their ceramite armor polished to a shine that caught the firelight of burning battlefields. They fought Orks in the dust-choked canyons of frontier worlds, where every echo of a bolter round was answered by the guttural roar of green-skinned hordes. They stood against the shifting tides of Genestealer cult uprisings, purging nests of corruption from the depths of manufactura, whose workers chanted their names in prayers of gratitude. When they marched, it was as if the Emperor himself walked at their side. Their victories swift and decisive, their losses few. But pride can be a subtle poison, and even in those early years, its taste lingered on their tongues. In victory, they began to see not merely the Emperor's will, but their own hand shaping destiny. Their chaplains thundered sermons that praised humility, yet in the quiet after battle, among the shadows of ruined cathedrals, brothers whispered of how their valor had turned tides no other force could. The first cracks were small, almost invisible, hidden beneath the polished surface of their devotion. It was in this time that they took their first great oath as a chapter. Upon the sacred altar of their fortress monastery, beneath the golden glow of 100 candles, every battle brother knelt, their palms pressed to the cold stone, their eyes lifted to the imperial Aquila carved deep into the vaults above. They swore to be the Emperor's steel, unyielding, incorruptible, eternal. Their words echoed through the halls like a vow that would never be broken. And yet, as history would prove, oaths are not chains strong enough to bind fate. Their campaigns grew more daring with every century. At the edge of Segmentum Obscurus, they stood against raiding fleets of Drukhari. Their lightning-fast strikes met with shields of ceramite and fire. They pursued chaos warbands into the shifting storms of the warp-touched regions, where their librarians felt the sting of whispers gnawing at their wards. And still they emerged victorious. With each triumph, The Imperium hailed them as exemplars of loyalty, paragons of strength. Statues were raised in their image, and their deeds were inscribed into the endless archives of Terra. But the higher one climbs, the greater the fall that awaits. What none could see then was the quiet weight pressing upon their souls. For every enemy slain, another rose. For every victory won, another war bled them dry. Astartes are immortal in body, but not in spirit, and even angels of death can feel the grinding toll of endless duty. Some brothers began to wonder if the Imperium's demands could ever be satisfied. Some questioned why entire generations of mortals, worlds upon worlds, were cast into ruin so easily, while the high lords of Terra sat secure upon their thrones. These thoughts were fleeting, half-formed, quickly drowned in prayer and duty. But like embers, they lingered, waiting for breath enough to spark flame. And yet, in this first chapter of their tale, they still stood resplendent. Their colors untainted, their oaths unbroken, their banners snapping proudly in the storm. They were the Emperor's steel. But steel, no matter how strong, can bend. And when bent far enough, it will break. The campaigns of their middle centuries were written in blood and silence. Wars stretched across dozens of systems, their forces dispersed as the Imperium called again and again upon their strength. What had once been celebrated crusades now became obligations, each summons a reminder that they were never their own masters. Yet they obeyed without question. To disobey the call of Terra was to abandon the very oath upon which they had been built. It was on the ash plains of Charon's fall that the first doubts took root. The world was little more than a husk, stripped bare by millennia of strip mining, its atmosphere choking with toxins. When a heretic uprising rose amidst the manufactoria, the chapter was dispatched to cleanse it. They found not hardened traitors, but wretches, workers whose skin had cracked and blackened from breathing poisoned air, whose bodies broke beneath labor demanded by distant lords who would never set foot upon their world. Starving and half-dead, the people turned to forbidden texts not out of hatred for the Emperor, but out of desperation for something, anything, that promised them hope. The purge was swift and merciless. Bolter fire tore through skeletal frames. Chains words rent the weak as easily as parchment, and Prometheum reduced their hovels to charred ruin. It was a victory, one that would be logged in the chapter's annals as efficient and complete. But in the silence after the guns, when the last heretic lay smoking on the ash, some brothers stood motionless, staring at the corpses. They had seen the foe destroyed, but had they seen evil defeated? One veteran, his armor slick with the blood of miners, whispered over the vox. "What sin is it to die begging for air?" His words were recorded, chastised, and purged from official record. But in the memory of those who heard, they lingered. Not long after, their librarians began to sense disturbances. Not from the warp storms that often plagued their routes, but from within their own dreams. Flickers of voices, indistinct and fleeting, like whispers through cathedral vaults. They prayed more fervently, doubled their litanies, and sought the stern guidance of their chaplains. The answer was always the same. Faith is the shield, the Emperor is the light, and doubt is the path of damnation. And still, in the quiet hours between wars, doubt gnawed. When the Imperium summoned them to defend a shrine world along the edge of the maelstrom, the chapter answered with zeal. It was here they faced their first great trial against the forces of chaos. The cult that had risen there bore no subtlety. They daubed their bodies in crimson sigils, held praises to gods unspoken, and unleashed demonic entities from the shadows. The Astartes cut them down, their bolters roaring hymns of holy fire, their chains words tearing through corrupted flesh with righteous fury. Yet amidst the carnage, the librarians felt the veil between reality's shudder. They heard laughter not from throats of men but from the air itself. They fought harder, desperate to silence it, and when the world was finally cleansed, the echoes of that laughter lingered long after the last demon was banished. That night, the chapter held a great vigil. Hundreds of warriors knelt in the fortress basilica of the shrine world, their armor dented and scorched, their heads bowed in solemn prayer. The chaplains thundered that they had triumphed, that their loyalty had been proven, that their vows held fast against corruption. Yet in the silence that followed those sermons, when the chanting ceased, the brothers felt not triumph but exhaustion. The demons had been banished, but what of the whispers that clung to their dreams still? It was then that a schism, subtle and unspoken, began to form. Some doubled their devotion, clinging fiercely to ritual and litany, drowning out every shadow with roaring hymns. Others grew silent, their questions locked away, festering behind eyes that burned with something more complicated than faith. None would voice it openly, not yet. But the bond between them, once seamless as steel, had begun to strain. Still they marched. Still they fought. To the Imperium they were paragons. To the worlds they saved they were angels. But among themselves, the weight of their vow began to feel heavier than their ceramite. Steel can endure much, but every strike leaves a mark. And they had been struck again and again and again. Time is a strange burden for the Adeptus Astartes. To mortals, decades pass like ages, entire dynasties rising and crumbling in the span of a single warrior's service. But to a space marine, centuries blur together, battles stacked upon battles until memory itself becomes a palimpsest of blood, smoke, and steel. For this chapter, the years weighed heavily, even as their reputation across the segmentum soared. They were the Emperor's hammer, reliable, unyielding, called upon whenever others faltered. But while the Imperium lauded them as exemplars of loyalty, the seeds of unease continued to grow. The first fracture appeared not upon a battlefield, but within their fortress monastery. The reclusium's vaults echoed with chants as the chaplains led their sermons. But behind closed doors, the librarians began to argue. The visions had not ceased. Too many of them dreamed of shadowed halls, of oceans black as oil, of voices promising both damnation and deliverance. Some insisted these were nothing more than the warp gnashing at their defenses, tests of their resilience. Others whispered, quietly, desperately, that perhaps the Emperor's silence had allowed the warp to creep too close, that his light no longer reached them as it once had. The chapter master, a stern warrior named Althoros, heard these concerns with an iron face. His word was absolute. They would not falter. His speeches rang with certainty, declaring that the Emperor demanded faith without compromise, that weakness of spirit was death in disguise. Yet in private, even Althoros was not immune. His dreams were plagued too, though he told no one. In the dead of night, he woke with his gauntlets clenched so tightly the servos screamed, the echo of unseen laughter clawing at his skull. The breaking point came during the siege of Valoria. The world was a fortress planet, its manufactoria vital to the nearby sectors, and its skies burned with green fire as Ork warbands descended in numbers beyond counting. The chapter answered the call, deploying almost their full strength. For months they fought across the broken hives, their bolters choked with ash, their chainswords gummed with alien ichor. Brothers fell by the score, and for the first time in generations, their losses were not easily replaced. The Orks fought without end, as if every fallen warlord birthed two more to take his place. It was on the 27th day of the siege that the librarians felt it again. Not laughter this time, but whispers, urgent, insistent. In the furnace of the fighting, amidst the endless waves of green, the voices grew louder. They did not mock. They offered strength, endurance, the power to break the Ork tide as easily as snapping bone. One among them, Imperium, faltered. In desperation, he reached for a heartbeat. His brothers saw him blaze with light not of the Emperor, but of something else, something colder, hungrier. The Orks before him were torn apart as if invisible talons had ripped their bodies open. And when it was over, Imperium stood in silence, his eyes hollow, his armor dripping with gore. The chaplains executed him at once. A bolt round through the skull, his body cast into the pyres with no name recorded. Officially, the record would state he fell in battle. The truth was hidden, but every brother who had seen it remembered. They remembered the power that had surged through him. They remembered how, for a moment, the Orks had been swept aside like dust before the storm. Valoria was won. The Orks were broken, the world saved, the Imperium triumphant. But the cost was deeper than the dead. In silence, doubt hardened into something else. Some saw Imperium's fate as proof of the warp's corruption, a warning never to falter. Others saw something more, a possibility, a weapon, a path unspoken. When the chapter returned to their storm-wracked homeworld, their banners still flew, their oaths still rang, but they no longer marched as one. Beneath the surface, brother eyed brother, and silence stretched between them. The vow of steel remained, but it had been struck, bent, and scarred. Steel that bends can be reforged, but steel that bends too far breaks. The chapter had not yet broken, but it was close. The silence after Valoria did not fade. Though their banners were raised high and their names spoken in triumph by the vox choruses of imperial worlds, within the chapter a subtle unease clung like smoke. Their fortress monastery became a place of echoes, its vaulted halls filled with brothers who spoke less than before, their voices heavy with something left unspoken. The chaplains thundered sermons with even greater fury, demanding penitence, demanding zeal. But their words felt less like litanies of faith and more like shields hastily raised against a storm already breaking through. The librarius was worst afflicted. Dreams grew sharper, more vivid. Brothers awoke gasping, their breaths rattling through vox grills, their gauntlets clenched until blood ran from their palms. The whispers that had once been faint murmurs now pressed against their ears even while awake, threading through the corners of thought. They did not come as commands, nor as the mocking laughter heard upon the shrine world, but as quiet suggestions. They spoke of strength unbounded, of burdens made lighter, of the chance to save brothers rather than burn them. They came wrapped not in the stench of damnation but in the tone of care, almost compassion. At first, the librarians confided in one another. In darkened chambers, their helms removed, their faces haggard despite the resilience of gene seed, they admitted what they heard. Some wept in shame, others clenched their teeth in rage, but all agreed on one thing. To speak openly of this was to invite judgment. The Imperium did not forgive weakness. The Inquisition did not tolerate questions. And so the silence deepened. When the summons to war came again, there was no time to dwell. A warp incursion had spilled across the edges of the Helican subsector, demonic entities clawing their way into reality through wounds left by careless heresy. The chapter mobilized, deploying strike forces into a dozen burning systems. In each, they fought like lions, their bolters roaring hymns of vengeance, their chains words howling as they tore demons back into the abyss. Yet the warp clung to them, thicker than ever. Even as they banished demons with holy flame, the whispers in their minds grew stronger, more insistent, as though the very act of defiance drew the voices nearer. One campaign became a crucible that none would forget. Upon the world of Iriath, the sky bled crimson and storms howled with voices that were not wind. The chapter descended into the ruins of hive cities where demons lurked in shattered hablocks and possessed machines roamed like predators. The librarians fought on the front lines, their psychic wards blazing, their voices raised in defiance. But each time they unleashed their power, the whispers pressed harder, almost guiding their hand, twisting their thoughts toward actions that were not wholly their own. Brother Sergeant Kalis remembered it vividly. Cornered in a manufactorum's skeletal remains, his squad faced a tide of warp spawn that clawed through the shadows. His librarian, Sirius, raised his staff and unleashed a storm of psychic flame. For a heartbeat, Kalis swore he saw something else in the fire. Not golden light, but a pale azure glow that burned too cold to be holy. The demons shrieked as they were consumed, their bodies unraveling into smoke. When it was over, Sirius staggered, his eyes hollow, his voice a whisper. "It was so easy," he muttered. None spoke of it again. Rumors spread quietly, drifting through the chapter like smoke. Some said their librarians had grown too strong, their power drawn from places no man should touch. Others claimed it was nothing more than strain, the warp gnashing its teeth against the shields of the faithful. But beneath the surface, an unspoken fear took hold. If they could not trust the minds of their own brothers, what foundation remained? The chapter master summoned councils, demanding reports, demanding honesty. But what could they say? To admit too much was to damn themselves. To admit nothing was to leave the fracture festering. In the end, they swore to redouble their rituals, to scour themselves with litanies, to fight harder, to endure. Yet in their hearts, each knew the whispers were not fading. They were growing stronger. And for some, the voices no longer sounded like threats. They sounded like promises. The campaign across the Helican subsector dragged on for years. Though the Imperium recorded victory after victory in the annals of the Administratum, the reality for the chapter was less triumphant. Each world retaken from the warp left behind scars that could never truly heal. Ruined cathedrals whose bells rang with hollow echoes, manufactoria stripped of workers too broken to labor, hive spires filled with the stench of the unburied dead. For the mortals of these worlds, salvation came at the cost of ruin. For the Astartes, salvation tasted of ash. The whispers did not relent. In fact, they grew clearer with every system reclaimed, as though the warp itself had fixed its gaze upon the chapter. What had begun as vague murmurs now spoke in tones that felt almost familiar. Some claimed to hear voices of fallen brothers, urging them not to waste their sacrifice. Others swore they heard the voices of primarchs, calling them toward a destiny grander than blind obedience. A few, tormented most, confessed to hearing the emperor himself, his tone weary but insistent, begging them to look beyond the chains of Terra's decrees. Most buried these thoughts beneath ritual. They lashed themselves in penance, burned incense until their chambers choked with smoke, recited the catechism of hate until their throats bled. But others listened, not openly, never openly, but in the silence between battles, when only the hum of power armor filled the air. They leaned into the whispers, and the voices rewarded them. Their strikes grew swifter, their aim surer, their endurance unbroken even after days of war without rest. It felt less like corruption and more like empowerment, as though the warp sought to aid rather than consume. It was on the blasted world of Serefis that this division first manifested in blood. The chapter had been ordered to defend a relic shrine against a chaos incursion. The foe a rabble of traitor marines and mortal cultists pouring from the wastes. For weeks the battle raged, the shrine's walls blackened with fire, its statues shattered beneath artillery. The chapter fought with all the fury of the Emperor's angels, their bolters thundering until the very ground seemed to quake. But the enemy pressed relentlessly, and even the indomitable began to tire. During the final assault, when the shrine's gates buckled beneath the weight of heretic war machines, a young librarian named Malchier gave in. Witnesses swore that his eyes burned with a violet fire as he raised his staff, and the enemy lines erupted as if torn apart by unseen claws. The heretics screamed, their armor buckling, their bodies ripped to shreds by power not born of Terra's light. His brothers were saved. The gates held. The shrine endured. But when the battle ended, the shrine floor was slick not only with the blood of heretics, but with the blood of those who stood beside Malchier. The chaplains declared him heretic and executed him before the assembled chapter. Yet even as his body burned upon the pyres, whispers spread. Had he not saved them? Had he not turned certain defeat into victory? Was his crime not survival, not strength, not loyalty of a different kind? These questions lingered, corrosive as acid. Some denounced him as damned. Others saw him as martyr. In the silence that followed, brothers began to see one another not as unbreakable steel, but as divided, uncertain, fallible. After Serefis, the chapter returned once more to their storm-lashed world, but their fortress monastery no longer felt like a sanctuary. Chaplains scoured the ranks for weakness, their sermons more furious than ever. The librarians withdrew, haunted by both visions and suspicion. The chapter master spoke often of vigilance, yet his words carried less conviction than before. His voice weighed with something he dared not name. It was then, in that uneasy stillness, that the whispers grew bolder still. They spoke no longer from dreams, but in waking moments. In the silence of the armory, as brothers polished their blades, voices threaded between the hum of power fields. In the training cages, as blades struck against ceramite, whispers coiled between the clang of steel. They did not taunt. They promised. They promised freedom. They promised strength. They promised the power to endure the wars that Terra endlessly demanded, wars that consumed their brothers without end. The chapter had not yet fallen. But the line between listening and believing had grown perilously thin. The months after Serefus were marked by silence, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of restraint, of a wound festering beneath ceramite and oath. The fortress monastery's halls echoed with ritual chants louder than before, as though sheer volume could drown out the whispers. Chaplains demanded longer vigils, harsher penances, and endless repetition of the emperor's words. Brothers flayed their own flesh in search of purity, carving the sigils of faith into their skin as if blood could prove loyalty. Yet still the whispers seeped in. No chain of liturgy could bind them. They came in moments of weakness, when exhaustion broke discipline, when doubt cracked the mind's armor. And slowly, subtly, those who had once only listened began to answer back. The first true fracture came upon the world of Athres. The system had been marked for exterminatus by the Inquisition, a hive world deemed irredeemably tainted by chaos cults. The chapter was dispatched not to save it, but to hold the orbitals until the fleet's cyclonic torpedoes completed their work. To stand guard while billions burned. For many, this was simply duty. The will of the emperor, unquestionable, immutable. But for others, the task gnawed at them like rust on a blade. They had bled for humanity's survival in 100 battles. Yet here they were, complicit in its deliberate annihilation. When the firestorms began and the hives split open like furnaces, some turned their eyes from the viewport, unwilling to witness. Others watched, and in the glow of the dying world, heard the whispers again. Is this salvation? Is this justice? On Athres, one company broke. Not in open rebellion, not yet, but in defiance. Captain Arvin led his warriors not to orbit, but to the surface. They claimed they sought to purge the cultists before exterminatus fell. But truth spread quickly. They had gone to rescue those still untainted, to shield innocence from the fire they knew was coming. They fought their way into the collapsing hives, cutting down heretics with the fury of gods, but also shielding civilians with their armored bulk, ushering terrified mortals into the holds of thunderhawks. When the torpedoes struck, fire swept across Athres. Billions died screaming, but thousands lived, crammed into the warships of the chapter. Those survivors saw not angels of death, but angels of salvation. And for the first time, the chapter tasted what it was to act by their own will, not Terra's decree. The High Lords did not see it that way. When word reached them, the Inquisition demanded answers. The chapter master himself was summoned to justify the actions of his sons. He returned from that council changed, his voice more guarded, his eyes shadowed, his words heavy with unspoken fury. He did not reveal what threats had been leveled, nor what judgment had been passed, but from that day forth, the chapter felt the Imperium's gaze upon them like the cold tip of a blade pressed to the throat. Still, the survivors of Athres lived. They were hidden, scattered across outposts and holds, their existence erased from official records. But the mortals remembered. They whispered of the angels who defied, saviors who had dared resist the Inquisition itself. And those whispers, like all whispers, found their way back to the chapter. The line between loyalty and defiance blurred. Some argued that their purpose had always been humanity's survival, not its sanctioned slaughter. Others clung to oaths, insisting that obedience to the throne was the only bulwark against damnation. Brothers argued in chambers where once there had been unity, their words sharp as blades. It was in this tension that the warp pressed hardest. The whispers, once indistinct, began to call names. They spoke directly to warriors who had doubted, to captains who had defied, to librarians who had already brushed the veil. They offered not only strength but absolution. Absolution for the sin of disobedience, for the guilt of Athres, for the blood spilled in contradiction of creed. They promised a path not of corruption, but of truth, to serve humanity without the chains of Terra. The chapter master ordered silence, forbidding all discussion of Athres, declaring it a forbidden word. But silence cannot erase memory, nor can prohibition still a conscience. The seed had been planted, and it grew in the dark. The first fracture had come. The second would be worse. For the whispers were no longer waiting. They were guiding, and soon they would demand more than listening. The breaking point came not in the silence of council, but in the roar of battle. It was on the industrial moon of Prime, a manufacturing world whose forges supplied half a sector's Astra Militarum regiments, when chaos warbands descended, spreading madness through its spires and warp fire through its streets. The Imperium called for aid. The chapter answered, descending in fire and thunder as they always had. Yet beneath the clash of bolter fire and the howling of demons, an older tension simmered. At first, all seemed as it had always been. The warriors of the chapter fought with the same precision, the same wrath. Chainswords screamed, plasma bolts seared, and the vox crackled with litanies of hatred. But as the battle wore on, a rift appeared, not in their armor, but in their choices. The librarians reported that much of the corruption stemmed from the manufacturing workers themselves, mortals twisted by promises of freedom and flesh. Imperial command demanded purging fire, the sterilization of every spire, regardless of who still lived within. The order was relayed. The chapter was to cleanse the world entire. It was then that Captain Arvin, the same who had defied on Athres, refused. His company spread through the manufacturums, not to kill indiscriminately, but to separate the corrupted from the clinging remnants of humanity. They forced the cultists back with storm of bolter shells, carving a path for the untainted to flee. Other companies, still rigid in their obedience, looked upon this act with outrage. Brothers who had once trained side by side now found themselves divided, some joining Arvin in his defiance, others denouncing him as traitor. The rift broke wide when the inquisitorial fleet arrived. Their command was simple: orbital bombardment, purge the world, end the risk. The chapter was ordered to withdraw and leave Prime to the fire. Some captains obeyed, ordering retreat. But Arvin did not. His thunderhawks continued to descend into the manufacturums, lifting mortals by the thousands, ferrying them to the strike cruisers waiting above. The Inquisition demanded immediate compliance. The chapter master stood before his sons, his voice ragged with the weight of impossible choice. He did not command them to obey, nor did he command them to resist. He gave only silence, and in that silence, the fracture became irreversible. The first bolt was fired in orbit not against an enemy, but against a brother. One ship, commanded by a loyalist captain, opened fire on Arvin's vessel, crippled it, and sent it burning into the upper atmosphere. Arvin and half his company perished in the firestorm, their screams swallowed by the void. But the survivors, those who had followed his example, swore never again to kneel to Terra's judgment. The world below burned. The Inquisition unleashed its wrath, and Prime was reduced to ash and ruin. But when the embers cooled, when the last manufacturum spire crumbled into dust, the survivors whispered of what had been done. They spoke of angels who had risked all to save them, and angels who had slain their own to prevent it. And the chapter, now divided, bore that memory like a brand. After Prime, there could be no return. Officially, the chapter remained whole, their reports sanitized, their losses blamed on the enemy. The Inquisition claimed victory, never naming the defiance that had nearly unraveled it. But within the chapter's own halls, silence curdled into suspicion. Brothers no longer prayed side by side without watching each other. Captains spoke with veiled words, measuring loyalty not to the emperor, but to their own conscience. And still the whispers endured. They praised Arvin as martyr, whispering that he had seen truth where others clung to lies. They urged the chapter to remember that humanity was not Terra, that salvation could not be measured in the tally of exterminated worlds. They promised strength to those who would continue what he had begun. The Inquisition believed the lesson had been delivered, that the chapter had been brought to heel by fire and loss. But they did not see the embers still glowing beneath the ash. For embers, if not extinguished, can ignite into flame. The first act of open defiance had been written in blood and betrayal. The next would be written in war, The fortress monastery was no longer a sanctum. Its stone walls, once echoing only with the rhythm of prayer and the hum of war gear, now carried the weight of unspoken division. Brothers marched past one another in the cloisters, their helm lenses locked forward, their armor freshly anointed yet cold with distrust. The heraldry of the chapter still gleamed upon every breastplate. The imperial Aquila still spread its wings across every banner, but the unity it symbolized had already withered. The wound of Caliph Prime had not healed. Instead, it festered in silence. Some whispered that Arvin's sacrifice had been noble, that his defiance proved the chapter's purity of purpose, unsullied by the corruption of politics. Others muttered that his death was justice, that he had dragged good warriors down into damnation with him. But all kept such thoughts behind closed teeth. To speak too openly was to invite suspicion, and suspicion was now as lethal as any blade. The chaplains fought harder than ever to bind the brotherhood together. Their sermons thundered in the cathedrals, their Crozius Arcanum striking sparks as they hammered the litany of obedience into the stone floors themselves. Yet even their words rang hollow, for it was not chaos that divided the chapter, it was conscience. And conscience cannot be scourged with sermons, nor silenced with threat. The first open breach came not in battle, but in ritual. During the rite of remembrance, when names of the fallen were carved into the adamantine walls, one librarian spoke aloud the name of Arvin. Gasps echoed through the hall, for the name had been forbidden, erased from record, struck from memory by decree of the chapter master. To speak it was heresy. And yet, when the librarian's voice rang out, others joined him, murmuring the name as though it were a prayer. That night, blood was spilled in the training cages. Brothers who had once sparred in comradely competition now fought with real fury, fists breaking ceramite, chains words drawn in earnest. No life was lost, but the fracture was plain. From that moment, the fortress became a place of camps, not a brotherhood. The Imperium's gaze, though distant, was never absent. Inquisitorial agents visited more frequently, their black-robed silhouettes drifting through the monastery like carrion crows. They asked questions, subtle at first, then pointed. Had whispers of sedition been heard? Did anyone doubt their oath to Terra? The chapter master deflected them with measured answers, but his own captains watched with unease. Was he shielding his sons, or betraying them piece by piece to keep the chapter alive? None knew, and mistrust grew. Then came the campaign of Targeth. The chapter was deployed alongside regiments of the Astra Militarum, a crusade to reclaim a cluster of worlds lost to Ork infestation. On the surface, it seemed the perfect chance to restore unity. An external foe, a just cause, a war worthy of their blades. Yet even in the fires of battle, division bled through. On the plains of Targeth Secundus, an entire city of conscripted mortals was surrounded by Ork warbands. The guard, outnumbered and outmatched, sent desperate pleas for aid. Half the chapter's forces broke from the main assault to intervene, cutting through the greenskins in a storm of fire to shield the imperiled humans. But the other half stayed their course, pursuing their assigned targets, deaf to the cries of the vulnerable. The Vox was alive with accusation. You abandon the Emperor's people. You stray from the plan, risking the war itself. You are not fit to wear that armor. By campaign's end, the Orks were defeated, but the rift within the chapter had widened into a chasm. In the eyes of the Guard, they were saviors. In the eyes of the Inquisition, they were unpredictable. In their own eyes, they were brothers no longer. And through it all, the whispers never ceased. They urged those who doubted to take the final step, to abandon pretense and embrace the path Arvin had begun. They hissed that loyalty to Terra was a chain, that true loyalty was to humanity, to the survival of the many. Others heard them differently, hearing only mockery and deceit, the promise of damnation disguised as mercy. But once a voice has been heard, it cannot be unheard. The war within had begun, not of bolter and blade, but of faith, of choice, of conscience. And conscience, once divided, always leads to blood. The fortress monastery was not built for brother to kill brother. Its training halls, its arming chambers, its reliquaries, every stone had been laid to foster unity, to bind warriors into a single purpose. Yet when the fracture deepened, Those same halls became a crucible of blood. The sanctum that had once echoed with chant and prayer now thundered with the clash of chainswords and the roar of bolters. The war that the chapter had feared most had come home. It began with an accusation. A squad returned from patrol to find their sergeant slain. His corpse desecrated with symbols not of chaos, but of crude mortal script. Arvan lives. To one side, it was proof of sedition, the rot of rebellion finally manifest. To the other, it was proof of a cover-up, a loyalist frame meant to silence dissent. Words escalated into blows, blows into blood. Within hours, the first brother had fallen not to Xenos, nor demon, nor heretic, but to the strike of a fellow Astartes. The chapter master tried to halt the descent, summoning his captains to council, but the chamber itself became a battlefield of voices. One captain demanded immediate purging of the dissenters, naming them heretics who would damn the chapter if left unchecked. Another shouted for restraint, declaring that blind obedience was the true heresy, that Arvan's example had proven where duty lay. The master's Crozius thundered against the floor, his voice rising like thunder, but his sons no longer listened as they once had. They listened only to their conscience, and to the whispers that had never ceased. The first true slaughter came in the reclusium. It was a place of worship, lined with towering statues of the emperor and banners blackened by centuries of incense. It should have been a sanctuary. Instead, it became a tomb. A chaplain, fierce in his loyalty, had gathered those who still swore unquestioned fealty to Terra. But word of the gathering spread, and those who felt betrayed stormed the hall in fury. What began as shouted scripture became a storm of blows. Crozius struck chainsword, relic shields shattered against storm bolters, and in the smoke of incense, brothers fell. The statues of the emperor looked down on the carnage, unyielding, their stony faces indifferent to the blood that slicked the marble floor. Some swore they saw the eyes of those statues darken, as if the emperor himself turned his gaze away in shame. Others whispered that the shadows between the icons deepened, that something unseen watched hungrily as brother's hand was turned against brother. Whether truth or fevered imagination, none could deny that something sacred had been broken that day, something that could never be restored. The killings spread like wildfire. Squads fractured mid-deployment, some refusing orders, others executing their own leaders. The halls of the fortress rang with sporadic gunfire, bolters echoing through corridors meant for solemn procession. Armories were raided, reliquaries desecrated as warriors armed themselves not for a crusade, but for civil war. And yet, even amidst the violence, hesitation lingered. Not every strike was made in fury. Some were slow, reluctant, as though the hand that guided the blade trembled even as it struck. Many wept as they killed, their voices breaking through the vox as they begged their brothers to yield, to repent, to turn away from a path that led only to ruin. But none did, none could. The chapter master himself stood as a figure caught in a storm. He did not command the purge, nor did he sanction rebellion. His silence, once meant to preserve unity, now served only to fracture it further. Some cursed him as coward, others revered him as the only thread still binding them together. But his indecision became its own weapon, wielded by both sides to justify their acts. The first brother-on-brother killings left scars that no bolter could mend. Those who fought saw their oaths shattered, their sacred bonds broken beyond repair. The fortress still stood, its walls intact, its banners unburned. But within, the chapter was already dead, its heart cut out by its own hand. The whispers, once faint, now swelled in triumph. They needed no further seduction, for the sons of the chapter had already done what chaos could not. They had become their own executioners. And somewhere, in the silence after the bloodshed, a truth began to harden in the minds of the rebels. They could no longer hide behind secrecy. They could no longer pretend at unity. If survival meant defiance, then defiance must become their creed. The fortress no longer smelled of incense and sacred oils. It reeked of blood, of ozone from discharged plasma, of the acrid sting of burning ceramite. Where once prayer had bound the chapter, now only ideology reigned, sharper and more merciless than any blade. This was no longer a brotherhood. It was two visions of truth, colliding again and again in corridors that had once been sanctified. One side clung to obedience. They called themselves the Emperor's true sons, loyalists who believed that every order, no matter how cruel, was necessary to preserve the Imperium. To them, Arvin was not a martyr, but a corrupter, his defiance the spark that had set the chapter aflame. Their chaplains bellowed that hesitation was heresy, that those who questioned the throne's will had already surrendered to the whispers of the warp. Their faith was steel, brittle and unyielding, forged in the conviction that to doubt was to die. The other side called themselves Redeemers, though they never spoke the name aloud in public. To them, loyalty to Terra had become betrayal of humanity itself. They remembered Athres, the billions burned by exterminatus, the helpless saved only by defiance. They believed Arvin's sacrifice had revealed the Emperor's true will, not to slaughter humanity, but to safeguard it, even against the Imperium's own cruelty. Their faith was not in decree, but in compassion, a compassion they wielded as a weapon against their brothers. Between these two camps, the librarians walked a dangerous line. Their psychic gifts made them especially vulnerable to the whispers, and some had already vanished into the shadows, their presence felt only in sudden eruptions of warp fire during skirmishes. Some loyalists declared all librarians suspect, calling for their execution. The Redeemers shielded them, claiming that the warp itself was not their enemy, only the lies of those who twisted it. Thus, the schism deepened further, with every argument turning into accusation, every prayer into a blade. The war was fought as much with words as with bolters. In the cloisters, brothers clashed not only with chains words but with scripture, hurling litanies like weapons, twisting ancient words to justify their cause. One chaplain roared that obedience was salvation, while another bellowed that mercy was the Emperor's truest command. Their voices thundered louder than the clash of steel, echoing through shattered halls until faith itself seemed to scream. Yet the whispers threaded through both sides, subtle and insidious. To the loyalists, they offered the taste of vengeance, urging them to purge their fallen brothers without hesitation, to cleanse the chapter in fire and rebuild it stronger. To the Redeemers, they spoke of freedom, of breaking chains forever, of a new brotherhood unbound by Terra's decrees. Few realized they were hearing the same source, twisted into different guises, shaping both sides toward inevitable ruin. The first great massacre came in the reliquary vaults, where sacred relics of the chapter's founding were kept. The Loyalists sought to guard them, claiming that the Redeemers would defile the holy artifacts in their sedition. The Redeemers, in turn, sought to seize them, declaring that the relics belonged to all sons of the Emperor, not just those who clung to blind obedience. The battle that followed raged for 3 days, its echoes shaking the mountain foundations themselves. When it ended, the relics lay shattered, their stasis fields broken, ancient banners burned to ash. Neither side claimed victory. Both only grieved, but neither yielded. Whispers spread that the Inquisition had learned of the chapter's unrest, that fleets were already mobilizing to erase them. If true, it mattered little. The chapter no longer feared outside judgment, for their worst enemy was already within their walls. They fought not for survival, but for conviction. And still, even in the blood, there was hesitation. Some brothers lowered their weapons mid-battle, unable to strike at faces they had once trusted with their lives. Some fell to their knees, screaming prayers into the smoke, begging the Emperor for guidance. Others fell silent altogether, staring into the bloodied marble as though searching for answers in the cracks. But the whispers grew louder. The line between conscience and corruption thinned. What had begun as argument and doubt now hardened into absolute creed. One side was certain obedience was salvation. The other, certain that defiance was the Emperor's hidden truth. Both were convinced the other was damned. And in that certainty, both sides became blind to what they were becoming. The civil war could no longer be contained within the stone halls of the fortress monastery. What began as skirmishes in cloisters and reliquaries spilled outward into the strike cruisers, the orbital docks, and the very void itself. The chapter had become a battlefield, its fleets fractured, its banners carried into war against their own reflection. Brother now hunted brother, not in whispers or accusation, but in open combat where the stars bore witness. The fortress sky was torn by fire. Strike cruisers once united under a single heraldry now fired broadside against one another, their lances piercing void shields, their torpedoes lighting the black with blossoms of destruction. Boarding actions raged across decks where once only the enemy had trod. Hallways filled with the thunder of power armor, the hiss of promethium, the shattering roar of storm bolters. Warriors who had once sworn eternal oaths of brotherhood fought through chambers painted with their own chapters' sigils, killing beneath the same banners that had bound them. In those battles, the fracture was no longer hidden. The Emperor's true sons, the Loyalists, fought with a fury born of desperation. They bellowed oaths of purity as they advanced, their chaplains hammering out the litany of hate even as they struck down their kin. They claimed they were cleansing rot, that every brother who fell was a blow struck against the sedition that would otherwise damn them all. Their eyes burned with grim resolve, with the knowledge that they were killing not for hate, but for survival of the Imperium's trust. The Redeemers fought with equal fervor, but their fury was tempered by conviction. They cried out that the Imperium had betrayed the Emperor's dream, that obedience was not loyalty but slavery. To them, each bolt fired was not against a brother, but against a tyrant's chain. They rescued mortals where they could, even in the midst of fratricide, proving their creed through action as well as words. But their mercy did not extend to the brothers who stood in their way. Against them, they unleashed their wrath with a sorrow sharpened into steel. The librarians, those caught between, became the storm's eye. Some stood with the Loyalists, shielding their minds with iron faith, wielding psychic fury against those they had once taught. Others cast aside restraint, channeling the warp with newfound abandon, claiming they had glimpsed visions of the Emperor freed from the throne, urging them onward. The fortress shook with their duels, warp fire tearing through chapels, psychic screams shattering stained glass into glittering rain. And still the whispers grew louder, promising strength to those who faltered, solace to those who doubted. The chapter master did not stay above the conflict. At last, he entered the fray, not to strike at either camp, but to quell them both. His blade cut through Redeemer and true son alike, his voice bellowing across vox channels as he demanded unity. Some obeyed, rallying to him, believing still that he alone could heal the wound. Others turned on him, declaring his indecision the true poison, his refusal to choose the path of cowardice that had damned them all. The master's armor was scarred by his own son's fire, his banner torn by his own son's blades. Yet still he fought, refusing to abandon the chapter even as it burned around him. Outside, in the void, the battle reached its zenith. A strike cruiser, crippled and aflame, rammed a brother vessel, their hulls grinding together as boarding torpedoes swarmed across. The detonation lit the system brighter than a sun, fragments of their once proud fleet scattering into the darkness. And in that void, where silence should have reigned, the whispers were louder still. They seemed to come not from within, but from without, borne upon the Imperium itself. They laughed, they praised, they coaxed. For chaos had no need to strike directly. It only needed to watch, to wait, and to harvest what remained. The fortress bled, the fleet burned, and the chapter that had once been a single blade of vengeance was now a broken shard, each edge cutting against the other. Yet even as the fires consumed them, both sides clung to their conviction. The true sons swore they fought for purity, that their sacrifice would prove their loyalty to Terra. The Redeemers swore they fought for humanity, that their rebellion was the Emperor's hidden will. Neither would yield, neither could, and the galaxy, ever hungry, prepared to claim whichever side weakened first. The civil war did not end in triumph. It ended in ruin. The fortress monastery was no longer a sanctum of devotion, but a mausoleum of shattered marble and burning reliquaries. The great statues of primarchs lay toppled, their faces cracked, their weapons shattered by the very sons who once knelt before them. The banners that had once draped the high halls in crimson and gold now hung in tatters, blackened by flame, slick with the blood of their bearers. The fortress had been a symbol of strength for centuries. Now it was a carcass rotting in orbit above a world already lost. The chapter master made his last stand in the sanctum where their gene seed was stored. Around him, the vaults that contained the lifeblood of their future burned, struck by bolter fire, torn apart by psychic storms. He fought with a fury that no longer sought to restore order but to preserve even the smallest fragment of his legacy. His blade moved like lightning, cutting down brothers from both camps as they fought not only him but each other in the shadow of extinction. His voice thundered above the chaos, demanding unity, begging for restraint, cursing the blindness that had consumed them. Yet no one listened. His words were drowned beneath the clash of ceramite and the crack of bolters. At last, the chapter master fell not to a single enemy, but to the weight of betrayal on every side. His armor, once resplendent, was scorched and broken. His final act was not a strike of his blade, but a desperate order transmitted across the Vox. Scatter. Survive. Remember the name of your blood, even if it becomes ash. His last breath was swallowed by fire as the sanctum collapsed, sealing him beneath the ruins along with what remained of the chapter's future. In the aftermath, neither side claimed victory. The Redeemers, though still alive in pockets, were scattered across the stars in stolen ships, fleeing imperial retribution that they knew would descend upon them. They took with them civilians they had sworn to protect, forming convoys of desperate souls bound for exile. Their voices remained unbroken, declaring themselves true heirs of the Emperor's will. Yet their hearts carried the weight of kinslaying. Every world they touched whispered rumors of fallen angels who brought both salvation and destruction in their wake. The true sons fared no better. Though they held fragments of the fortress and some ships that remained loyal, the Imperium did not see their survival as proof of faith. Instead, suspicion fell upon them as it always does upon a chapter torn from within. They were summoned, investigated, questioned by the Inquisition. Their answers mattered little. To the High Lords, a chapter that had turned on itself was already half lost. Reinforcements were denied, supplies withheld, and their name recorded with a mark of doubt. They remained loyal, but they were loyal pariahs, shunned by those they had killed to protect. And then there were those who did not choose. Companies cut off during the fighting, strike cruisers lost in the void, brothers who had abandoned both sides in disgust. Some wandered as mercenaries, others vanished into the black, their heraldry repainted, their oaths broken. These fragments became ghosts of the chapter, scattered seeds of betrayal and regret drifting across the galaxy. Some were claimed by the Black Legion, others by renegade warbands. A few still fought in the Emperor's name, though none would ever again speak their chapter's title aloud. The fortress itself was left to die, orbiting a dead world, broken and bleeding. It became a tomb haunted not by silence but by whispers. Servitors malfunctioned, Vox systems sparked to life unbidden, and the shadows grew long in halls where no warrior remained. Those whispers, the same that had sown doubt, stoked wrath, and twisted brotherhood into bloodshed, lingered still. Chaos had not won in the sense of conquest. It had not needed to. It had broken the blade without lifting a hand, and the shards would cut the galaxy for centuries to come. When the Imperium finally declared the chapter lost, the record was purged with cold precision. Their names stricken, their heraldry sealed, their history buried in archives that none but the Inquisition might read. To the galaxy, they were nothing more than another tragic cautionary tale, another entry in the endless ledger of chapters that had risen, fought, and vanished into shadow. To those who survived, however, their name was not forgotten. It lingered as both curse and banner. Some whispered it in prayer. Others spat it as a scar. Thus the chapter's legacy was not annihilation, but exile. Their blood flowed still, carried in the veins of warriors across the stars, each fragment a living reminder of their fall. Some swore to rebuild, others to redeem, still others to destroy what remained. But none could escape the truth. The chapter had broken itself, and in that breaking had become eternal. And so, in the end, the whispers were right. Chaos had not needed to claim them whole. It only needed to wait, and when the time was ripe to whisper, the chapter had destroyed itself. The Imperium does not mourn its lost sons. It buries them beneath ink and silence. When word of the chapter's implosion reached Terra, there was no ceremony, no lamentation, no sorrow recorded in the archives of the High Lords. Instead, quills scratched across parchment, seals of wax were pressed, and the chapter's name was marked with a black line that would never again be lifted. To those who held the levers of power, the fall of yet another chapter was neither tragedy nor outrage, but inevitability. The galaxy is vast. The ledger of loyalty is written in fire, and in such fire many names are consumed. Yet the erasure was not perfect. Nothing in the Imperium ever is. Fragments of records remained, scattered across astropathic transmissions and battlefield reports that had escaped censure. Imperial guardsmen remembered the tall, armored figures who had once fought beside them, only to turn their guns upon each other in a frenzy of betrayal. A single Adeptus Mechanicus data slate, thought corrupted and forgotten, contained within it encrypted schematics of the chapter's fortress monastery, annotated with notes that ended abruptly on the day of the final battle. To the Inquisition, these remnants were not evidence of survival, but seeds of contagion, proof that whispers had once found fertile ground. They were marked for cleansing, yet they endured. For those who had fled, the exiled redeemers who had carried ships full of civilians into the void, life became a nomadic crusade without destination. They declared themselves still true to the Emperor, though no imperial world would grant them harbor. Their convoys drifted through the dark, raiding orc-infested outposts, striking against chaos marauders, seizing food and fuel from any world that would not willingly give it. To the Imperium, they were renegades. To the desperate colonies they protected, they were angels of vengeance who arrived like ghosts, fought with inhuman fury, and departed before thanks could be given. Yet always, the mark of their shame followed them. Every planet they touched whispered a different name for them. The exiles, the broken, the cursed angels. None spoke the title they had once carried proudly. Among the true sons who remained, survival took a different shape. They presented themselves before the Ordos Hereticus and the Administratum, declaring their loyalty, reciting oaths that had been carved into their souls since the moment of their creation. Their words were steadfast, but their eyes carried the weight of kinslaying. They did not flinch when the Inquisitors pressed them, but neither could they conceal the scars. To the Imperium, such scars were damning. Their reinforcements never arrived. Their requests for gene seed tithe replacement were delayed into oblivion. Their chapter halls, though half rebuilt, echoed with emptiness as the years passed and no new recruits came. They were loyal, yes, but loyalty marked by suspicion, a loyalty twisted into isolation. In the wider galaxy, the fragments who had abandoned both sides became stories of their own. Some fell to chaos outright, their bitterness turning them toward the black promises of warbands eager for their skill and gene-forged strength. Others lived as wanderers, never painting heraldry upon their armor again. Their oaths reduced to personal vendettas, their blades hired to causes that mattered only to them. A few clung to their duty in silence, continuing to fight the Emperor's wars even though no banner welcomed them. Such warriors would arrive unbidden on the battlefield, fight with unmatched ferocity, and vanish before questions could be asked. To guardsmen who glimpsed them, they were ghosts. Space Marines with no chapter, no name, only fury. The galaxy is vast, and in that vastness memory twists into myth. In one sector, the renegades were whispered of as angels who fought against demons when all others fled. In another, they were cursed as monsters who burned villages and slaughtered civilians. Each tale bore fragments of truth, but none told the whole. Over centuries, the chapter's story became a puzzle scattered across 1,000 stars, impossible to piece together, deliberately obscured by the Imperium itself. And through it all, the whispers endured. For whispers are not erased by decree, nor silenced by flame. They followed the exiles through the void, murmured in the ears of the loyal as they stood watch upon their lonely battlements, and haunted the nameless wanderers who sought solace in endless battle. They carried the same message as before. You are forgotten, abandoned, betrayed. The Imperium has cast you aside. Only the dark gods remember you now. It was in this crucible of silence and exile that the chapter's remnants were remade. No longer one name, no longer one heraldry. They became a scattered legacy, a living contradiction. Angels of death still, yet cursed by the very empire that birthed them. Each path carried them further from what they had once been, yet closer to what the Whispers desired. The fall of the chapter had not ended with fire in their fortress monastery. It had only begun. Chaos is patient. Where the Imperium demands obedience and punishes even the faintest hint of weakness, the dark gods do not rush. They wait, as they always have, for cracks to widen and scars to fester. For the broken remnants of the chapter, those cracks were already deep. The exiles drifted across the void, hunted by the Imperium, cut off from their gene-seed vaults, their fleets sustained only by plunder and desperation. The loyal survivors clung to their halls in isolation, their names struck from record, their pleas ignored. The wanderers fought without purpose, each day another battle, each night another prayer unanswered. In such places of despair, whispers grow loud. The first to turn were not the loudest or the proudest. They were the forgotten stragglers, the strike cruiser that had limped into the Eye of Terror with its engines failing, the squad left stranded on a dead world when reinforcements never came, the solitary battle brother who had watched his brothers die and could not bear silence. For them, chaos was not revelation but survival. A demon whispered in a dream, a sorcerer offered sanctuary, a warband extended an invitation. And when the choice was between extinction and damnation, many did not see a choice at all. From these seeds, warbands were born. Their colors were changed, their heraldry defaced, but fragments of their former selves still lingered. Some still fought with the zeal of the Redeemers, swearing they carried the Emperor's will even as they bled in service to the dark gods. Others retained the rigid pride of the true sons, convincing themselves that discipline was strength, even as they marched beneath banners steeped in sorcery. These contradictions only deepened the corruption, for chaos delights not only in victory but in irony. A warrior who believes himself still faithful while wielding demon-forged weapons is a finer prize than one who openly bows. Yet not all who heard the whispers fell so easily. The Redeemers who wandered with their convoys of civilians resisted with fury. They fought demons that rose from warp storms. They burned heretical idols when they found them. They killed their own when whispers drove one of their number too far astray. Their resistance became legend among those who followed them, whispered from generation to generation of the refugees they protected. But resistance came at a price. Each battle against chaos drained them further, each betrayal cut deeper, and each unanswered prayer to the Emperor left more of them hollow. It was not enough to win battles if the war within their souls was already lost. The Imperium itself became an unwitting ally of chaos in this work of unraveling. The true sons, left isolated and denied the lifeblood of recruits and supplies, began to rot in stagnation. Their fortress grew cold, their ranks thin. And into that silence came the same voices that had once sown their first divisions. The whispers did not command, they suggested. Why had the Imperium abandoned them? Why did the Inquisition mark them as suspect when they had bled to preserve loyalty? Why should they remain faithful to an empire that offered only suspicion and neglect? The questions seeded doubt, and doubt, unspoken and unacknowledged, is the first chain of damnation. Even beyond the warriors themselves, myths began to spread among the worlds of the Imperium. On frontier colonies, settlers told stories of angels who had once fought for them but were cast out by the High Lords. On hive worlds, heretical cults invoked their name as proof that the Imperium devours its own sons, claiming the Renegade chapter as martyrs of imperial cruelty. To some, they were heroes abandoned. To others, they were traitors. To chaos, they were both, and both narratives served its purpose. What made the whispers most effective was their adaptability. For the exiles, the voice spoke of mercy, of a father who would never forsake them, unlike the silent emperor. For the loyal remnants, it spoke of justice, of vengeance against an Imperium that had betrayed their faith. For the wanderers, it offered only purpose, an end to meaningless battles, a cause in which to burn their rage. Each mask was different, yet the voice was the same. Slowly, warbands bearing fragments of their heraldry began to appear at the edges of the Eye of Terror, or emerging from warp storms in forgotten sectors. Some fought openly as servants of chaos, their banners drenched in the sigils of the dark gods. Others cloaked themselves in half-truth, fighting alongside Imperial forces for a time, only to vanish when the battle turned. The Imperium branded them heretics, but never fully stamped out the rumor that some fragment of them still fought with honor. That ambiguity was itself a weapon. The chapter had once been one blade, sharp and unbreakable. Now it was 1,000 shards scattered across the galaxy, each cutting in a different direction. Chaos did not need to forge them into a single weapon. It needed only to scatter them further, to let their contradictions bleed into every war they touched. The Imperium, ever blind to nuance, would crush them all alike, driving the faithful fragments further into exile, pushing the hesitant closer to damnation. For some, the caution became obsession. Entire chapters reshaped their traditions in silent response, tightening discipline, stamping out deviation with fire and oath. Their chaplains spoke with harsher tongues, their librarians watched with greater suspicion, their masters demanded unquestioning obedience. They whispered that vigilance was the only bulwark against damnation, though none dared speak the name of the example they feared to follow. In this way, the fall of the chapter shaped the culture of the Astartes themselves, long after the Imperium had officially erased it. Chaos understood this better than any. They knew the story of the chapter was not merely one of conquest but of infection. The truth of what had happened mattered less than the perception of it. By turning their memory into both a curse and a promise, Chaos ensured that the chapter's legacy became a weapon sharper than any blade. On demon worlds, their likenesses were carved into black stone, their armor rendered in grotesque parody. Some warbands even claimed to descend from them, true or not, using their myth as currency among the dark gods. The irony was perfect. The Imperium had sought to erase them to deny Chaos its prize, yet that very silence made them all the more alluring to heretics. Among the exiles still wandering the stars, these ripples were chains. They bore the weight of myths they did not create, hunted not only for what they had done but for what others believed of them. Civilians whispered their names in awe, cultists painted their sigils in mockery, Imperial commanders cursed their memory as fuel for rebellion. The Redeemers, still clinging to their convoys, fought desperately to protect those who followed them. Yet even their victories were twisted into legend that blurred truth and falsehood. They fought demons, yet some called them demonic. They saved colonies, yet others claimed they burned them. Each act became distorted, refracted through the lens of propaganda and rumor until even they could no longer tell how they would be remembered. The true sons, huddled in their decaying fortress, bore their own torment. They fought as loyalists still, answering what calls for aid reached them, though fewer came with each passing century. Yet even as they shed blood for the Emperor, whispers of their curse traveled with them. Guardsmen stared with wide eyes, muttering prayers as though fighting beside ghosts. Imperial commanders flinched when they entered the room, torn between gratitude and suspicion. It was not corruption that hollowed them, but neglect sharpened by the myth of their own shame. Thus the chapter, broken though it was, continued to shape the galaxy long after its fall. It shaped rebellions, heresies, even the doctrine of loyalists who had never met them. Their absence spoke as loudly as their deeds once had. And in every whisper, every rumor, every distorted tale, Chaos fed, smiling upon a victory it had not needed to lift a hand to claim. The Imperium thought silence would bury them. Instead, silence ensured that their echoes would never end. There are whispers in the galaxy that refuse to die, no matter how carefully the Inquisition burns them from records, no matter how many worlds are cleansed in fire. The lost chapter became one of these whispers, an ember of memory that glowed in the dark, impossible to stamp out. What had once been a name of honor transformed into a prophecy, a curse, and a promise, all at once. On frontier shrines, fevered preachers raved that the angels who had vanished would return at the end of days. Some claimed they would descend from the stars as saviors, wielding fire to burn away both chaos and Imperium alike, heralds of a purer age. Others twisted the tale, declaring that their return would be the final doom, the proof that even the Emperor's children could never escape the pull of the abyss. Every prophecy contradicted the next, yet all carried the same weight, the certainty that their story was not finished. The cults of chaos embraced this ambiguity with open arms. To them, the chapter's fall was living scripture. Demon prophets proclaimed that the lost ones had not merely fallen, but had been chosen, the favored warriors of the gods, who would one day lead the long war to its final victory. Their names were carved into flesh, painted across sacrificial altars, shouted in unholy litanies before raids. Some warbands even painted their armor in the chapter's old colors, though twisted and corrupted, claiming lineage they could never prove. Whether true or false, the image was powerful. For mortals, the promise of fighting under the banner of fallen angels was irresistible. Even within the Imperium, the myth became an infection. The Ordo Malleus denounced the prophecies as lies, but still they listened. The Ordo Hereticus scoured frontier worlds with greater zeal, desperate to silence the preachers before the words spread further. And yet, some inquisitors could not help but wonder. What if the prophecies are true? What if the lost chapter will rise again? Loyal, corrupted, or something between? Such doubt, even whispered in private, was poison, for the Inquisition thrived on certainty. But the poison spread, because the silence of the records had left too much space for speculation. Among the exiles themselves, the prophecies became a torment. The Redeemers, wandering still among refugee fleets, heard them whispered by civilians they protected. Children stared at them with wide eyes, speaking of ancient legends. Some begged them to fulfill the role of saviors. Others spat and called them heralds of damnation. The warriors bore it in silence, but within their hearts the weight grew. Each act of salvation seemed to confirm the myths. Each act of violence seemed to fulfill the curses. They were no longer merely men of war. They were symbols, twisted into whatever shape the galaxy demanded. The true sons, dwindling within their decaying fortress, faced the same burden in a different form. Astropaths brought them fragments of the outside galaxy, broken messages that spoke of their legend. They knew they were dying, yet their name was growing more powerful than they had ever been in life. Their chaplains raged at the irony that in being forgotten by the Imperium, they had been remembered by all others, that in silence they had become eternal. It is said even the Black Library holds fragments of their story. Eldar seers whisper that among its endless tomes lies a shattered chronicle of the chapter, written not by man, but by fate itself. Some claim it speaks of their role in the Renegade, the final war of all things. Whether as saviors, betrayers, or mere pawns, none can agree. But the fact that their name lingers in the labyrinthine archives of the craft worlds ensures that their shadow is longer than the Imperium would ever admit. The ultimate cruelty is this: the chapter's true fate no longer matters. They may die in exile, their last survivors extinguished in silence. They may endure a little longer, wandering among broken fleets or guarding ruined fortresses. Changes nothing. The galaxy has already written its prophecy upon them. In every whispered tale, every twisted cult, every forbidden scroll, they live on not as men, but as myth. And myth is harder to kill than flesh. Thus the chapter, lost to the records of the Imperium, became eternal in the minds of its enemies and its people. A shadow that stretches across centuries, a curse that the Inquisition cannot burn, a promise that chaos will never stop exploiting. Their legacy is not one of victory or defeat, but of haunting, a scar carved into the fabric of Warhammer 40K itself. The Imperium may forget their name. The galaxy never will. The galaxy is a graveyard, and every star system bears the bones of 1,000 tragedies. In such a place, the fate of a single chapter should mean little. And yet, the fall of one brotherhood of the Emperor's angels reverberates endlessly, because their story is not merely their own. It is a reflection of the Imperium itself, glorious, cursed, and trapped in a cycle of triumph and ruin. To understand the end of the Renegade chapter is to glimpse the truth of the wider age, that no loyalty is safe, no oath eternal, and no name unbreakable. When they were first raised, the chapter was meant to be eternal. Each gene seed was a fragment of the Primarch's legacy, each suit of armor a relic forged to last 1,000 wars. The Imperium does not build its warriors to fade quietly. They are designed to endure, to pass their duty down through endless generations of recruits, each one bound to the next by faith, war, and blood. The chapter that fell was no exception. Yet eternity is a lie in the grim darkness of the far future. Every fortress will one day fall. Every oath will one day be tested. And for this chapter, eternity proved far shorter than the dream that birthed them. Their ruin was not sudden. It was slow, grinding, inevitable. It began in whispered doubts and deep cracks hidden beneath the surface, the kind that fester over centuries until the weight of war pries them open. For some, it came through fire, worlds burned, faith shattered, and pride twisted into defiance. For others, it came through silence, endless wars fought without recognition, honor stripped away by a master that demanded loyalty but gave none in return. What broke them was not chaos alone, nor rebellion, nor betrayal. What broke them was the universe itself, relentless and unyielding. The Imperium cannot mourn them, not truly. To acknowledge the chapter's fall would mean admitting that even its most faithful children can falter. It would mean looking into the mirror and seeing weakness reflected back. And so the High Lords erase their name from the records, declaring their fate unworthy of memory. Yet in erasure lies its own cruelty. To be remembered as a traitor is at least to exist. To be forgotten is to die twice, once in flesh and again in history. This, above all else, is the punishment the Imperium chose for them. But the galaxy does not abide silence. For every record burned, 10 rumors rise. For every attempt to bury their memory, a prophet unearths it again. Chaos feeds on the forgotten, and the gods take delight in the irony that those who are most despised by the Imperium become immortal in infamy. Thus the chapter is condemned to wander eternity as a ghost. Not alive, not dead. Not remembered, not erased. Simply haunting. The tragedy of the chapter is not that they fell. Many chapters fall. The tragedy is that they reveal the truth of all the Imperium's champions. That every oath is a gamble against despair, and despair always wins in the end. What loyalty can endure when the Emperor himself sits silent upon his throne, neither blessing nor condemning, a corpse whose will must be interpreted through the hands of mortals? What chapter can truly endure the weight of centuries of endless war without cracks forming in their spirit? In this, the Renegade chapter is not an exception. They are a warning, and so, their story is not simply their own. It is the story of all the Imperium's warriors, of the Astra Militarum who fight and die without recognition, of the Sisters of Battle who burn worlds to preserve a faith that may never answer, of the custodians who stand vigil before a throne of silence. Each is loyal. Each is unyielding, and yet each carries within them the seed of the same tragedy. For if the angels of the Emperor can fall, who among them is truly safe from damnation? The galaxy does not ask that question aloud, for it is too dangerous. But it lingers, unspoken, in every prayer, every vow, and every silence. The lost chapter is proof that the Imperium's strength is also its weakness, that its eternity is nothing but the longest possible march toward collapse. Their fall is not an isolated story. It is the mirror of the Imperium's own fate. It is often said that the Emperor does not answer prayers. His silence is absolute, broken only by the whispers of his priests and the flickering beacon of the Astronomicon. Yet, in that silence, humanity has built its greatest empire, worshipped its greatest god, and committed its greatest atrocities. The lost chapter became another question hurled into that void, an unanswered plea that reveals the emptiness at the heart of faith. Were they forsaken because of their weakness, or did their weakness bloom because they had already been forsaken? The Imperium will never ask that question aloud, for to do so would risk unraveling everything. Faith is the Imperium's foundation, its unbreakable spine. It is the one constant that binds 1 trillion souls together across the gulfs of space. But faith is also a blade with 2 edges. It can inspire sacrifice beyond imagining, but it can also breed doubt, fanaticism, and despair. The lost chapter proves this truth. Those who endured among the Redeemers did so because of faith in humanity itself, not merely the Emperor. Those who withered into the true sons clung to dogma and ritual until it became a tomb around them. And those who fell to chaos did so because faith, once broken, turned to hatred with equal intensity. Each path was carved by faith, and each was destroyed by it. The Emperor himself remains silent on which was right. Perhaps there is no answer. Perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all. That the galaxy does not care. In the endless night, victories and defeats blur together until all that remains are stories told by survivors, warped by memory and myth. The chapter's legacy is thus no longer about who they were or what they believed. It is about what others make of them. In faith, silence becomes prophecy. In despair, absence becomes proof of betrayal. In the hands of chaos, silence becomes the loudest answer of all. Even within the Inquisition, the tale gnaws like a parasite. What does it mean if the Imperium's chosen can be erased so thoroughly? Does that not mean that any chapter, any order, any regiment could vanish tomorrow if the High Lords willed it so? To serve loyally for centuries, to die on 100 worlds, and then to be struck from record without even the dignity of condemnation. Is this not a deeper horror than betrayal? For what is the value of loyalty if memory itself can be taken away? The wider galaxy views the story differently. To the Eldar, it is a tragic inevitability. They see the same flaw that doomed their own empire reflected in humanity's angels, the hubris to believe themselves eternal, while the universe itself corrodes from within. To the Orks, the chapter's fall is irrelevant. Another band of humies broken, another war to be fought. But even the Necrons, cold and machine-like, have recorded fragments of the chapter's end in their endless archives of history. To them, it is proof that flesh is weakness, that even the strongest gene-forged warriors eventually turn to dust and ash. The gods thrive on contradiction, and the lost chapter embodies it perfectly. Here was loyalty transformed into rebellion. Here was purity turned into corruption. Here was eternity reduced to dust. Every demon, every cult, every heretic carries their tale as a banner of inevitability. If the angels of the Emperor can fall, so too can any mortal. Their faith in the chapter is not faith at all, but celebration of entropy, the delight in watching oaths crumble and meaning rot away. For them, the lost chapter is proof that hope is nothing but a longer road to despair. And yet, the galaxy cannot let go of them. Every myth, every rumor, every prophecy ensures they live on. The Imperium wants silence, but silence breeds questions. Chaos wants damnation, but damnation breeds awe. Even those who stumble across fragments of the story in the black libraries of forgotten worlds find themselves entranced, because the tale is not just about warriors in armor. It is about the eternal question. What does it mean to serve a god who does not answer? The lost chapter has become a prism, refracting the Emperor's silence into infinite meanings. Each interpretation says more about those who hold it than about the warriors themselves. In this, they are no longer a chapter at all. They are an idea immortal precisely because they are unknowable. The silence of the lost chapter has not faded with time. It has deepened, stretched across centuries like a wound that refuses to heal. Every age of the Imperium finds new ways to reinterpret that silence, new meanings to graft upon their absence. For the warriors who still march beneath the Imperial Aquila, their erasure is a warning. Loyalty will not save you from oblivion. For the cultists of chaos, their fall is a hymn. Rebellion is inevitable, and every oath is destined to break. For civilians, priests, and wanderers who whisper their story by candlelight, it becomes something stranger still. A story of angels who walked among men and then vanished, leaving behind a question no one dares answer. That question haunts even those who refuse to speak it aloud. Did the Emperor know of their fall? Did his great golden will watch as his angels broke upon the grinding stone of the galaxy, and simply let them collapse? Or was he blind, locked within his throne, incapable of lifting a hand to save them? To most of the Imperium, these thoughts are heresy, questions that lead only to fire and the pyre. But in the private chambers of confessors, in the mutterings of broken veterans, In the sleepless thoughts of inquisitors who know too much, the question lingers still. Silence can be endured for a time. Across 10,000 years, silence becomes unbearable. The silence also became a mirror. When the Astra Militarum fights and dies in endless legions, nameless and unremembered, the soldiers see themselves in the lost chapter. They too will be erased when their usefulness ends. When a forge world burns and its Scutarii vanish into the black void, their tech priests reflect on the silence and wonder if even iron loyalty is meaningless. When the Adepta Sororitas scour worlds in flame, they remind themselves of the chapter and whisper prayers with greater fervor, determined not to join the forgotten. The lost chapter is not just a story. It is a shadow cast over all who serve. But a shadow is never just absence. It is also shape. The chapter's silence has been sculpted into myths that inspire as much as they terrify. On backwater shrine worlds, pilgrims pray to nameless angels who will return in humanity's darkest hour. They believe the chapter was hidden, not destroyed, kept in exile until the Emperor himself calls them back. In the face of tyrannid swarms and Necron awakenings, these myths spread like wildfire, because hope, even false hope, is a weapon against despair. On the opposite side, Chaos warbands paint those same myths in black and blood, claiming that when the angels return, they will lead the charge to overthrow the Imperium. One story, two interpretations, both feeding the galaxy's endless hunger for prophecy. The Inquisition, of course, despises this ambiguity. They work tirelessly to silence the myths, but they cannot erase them entirely. Each purge only gives the story greater weight, for if the tale were meaningless, why kill to protect it? The harder they press, the deeper the silence echoes. And so the myth grows, not in libraries or data vaults, but in the hearts of mortals who need stories to survive. In the end, the chapter's silence is louder than any cry of rebellion. It reverberates because it cannot be resolved. If they had fallen openly to chaos, they would have been cursed and condemned, like the word-bearers or the Night Lords. If they had died loyal, their names would be honored in the rolls of remembrance, carved into marble on Terra itself. But they exist in neither category. They are a blank page, an unfinished story, and in that unfinished space the galaxy fills in its own meanings. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy. The warriors themselves no longer matter. The redeemers wandering among refugee fleets, the true sons decaying in their fortress, the traitors screaming their hatred into the warp. All of them are irrelevant to the greater weight of their silence. They are men of flesh and gene seed, but the galaxy has turned them into symbols, and symbols are eternal. The lost chapter does not speak. Yet in that silence, the Imperium hears its doubt, chaos hears its triumph, and mortals hear their hope. In truth, the silence is not silence at all. It is a chorus of meanings, each more powerful than the voices of the warriors themselves. And so, they remain, forgotten in name, eternal in myth, an absence that has become one of the loudest echoes in the galaxy. In time, the lost chapter ceased to belong to itself. Whatever warriors remained in exile, whatever scattered survivors clung to life on forgotten battlefields, they were no longer the keepers of their own story. The galaxy had seized it, reshaped it, and bound it into the endless cycle of myth. And once a story becomes myth in the 41st millennium, it no longer dies, it repeats. That repetition is the cruelest part. Every generation rediscovers the silence, whispers of nameless angels who were erased, and reshapes it to fit their own fears and hopes. A priest on a hive world tells his starving flock that the Emperor sent his angels into exile, where they wait to return and deliver the faithful from ruin. A warlord of chaos boasts that the lost chapter already fights under his banner, their souls claimed by his patron god, proof that loyalty to the corpse emperor is meaningless. An orc warboss, though unable to articulate the legend in human words, bellows that humies always break, always fall, always fight among themselves until there's nothing left to crump. In each case, the myth is not about the chapter, it is about those who tell it. The cycle feeds itself. Every rumor sparks another. Every silence demands filling. The Inquisition can burn a world to ash to silence one heretic preacher. But the flames themselves carry the myth further, whispered in the terrified mouths of survivors. The ecclesiarchy can denounce the story as heresy, yet the very act of denial lends it weight. To forbid a tale is to prove it dangerous. And so the myth of the lost chapter becomes self-sustaining, impossible to kill. For those who still live within the chapter's fractured remnants, this truth is a torment beyond measure. The Redeemers hear themselves praised as saviors, worshipped as angels, cursed as traitors. None of it feels real, yet all of it is realer than their lives. Each act of compassion they offer is not their own, but interpreted as proof of prophecy. Each blade drawn in defense of the weak is not seen as duty, but as destiny fulfilled. They are prisoners of expectation, denied even the dignity of their own choices. The true sons suffer the same burden in silence. Within their decaying fortress, they perform rituals to keep their faith alive, but they know their chapter is already a legend outside their walls. Their words, their deeds, their loyalty, none of it matters. The galaxy has already decided what they are. The myth will outlive their bones, twisted by every tongue that repeats it. They are condemned not only to die in silence but to live forever in distortion. This is the cycle of Warhammer's grim darkness. History is devoured by silence. Silence breeds rumor. Rumor becomes myth. And myth is weaponized until the truth no longer matters. Every legion, every chapter, every order of man or Xenos eventually falls into this pattern. Even the Primarchs are more myth than fact, their deeds reshaped by millennia of half-remembered chronicles and ecclesiarchal sermons. In such a galaxy, the lost chapter's fate is not unique. It is inevitable, yet inevitability does not dull the tragedy. If anything, it sharpens it. The cycle strips away individuality, erases the truth of men who once had names, brothers, victories, and failures, and leaves only a symbol, an abstraction divorced from the flesh that birthed it. The lost chapter's warriors are not remembered as men of blood and bone, who laughed, who bled, who prayed in silence. They are remembered as cautionary tales, omens, promises of doom or salvation. They are remembered as everything but themselves. And perhaps this is the greatest reflection of the Imperium itself. Humanity has built an empire where truth is irrelevant, where silence is more powerful than voices, and where myth becomes reality because it is repeated often enough. The lost chapter is simply one thread in this larger tapestry, a single example of a cycle that will never end. For in the 41st millennium, there is no truth, no resolution, no final answer. There is only repetition. The lost chapter fell. The lost chapter was erased. The lost chapter was reborn in rumor. And tomorrow, in another age, they will fall again, erased again, reborn again. The cycle will continue until the stars themselves burn out. The story of the lost chapter ends not with a battle, not with a triumph, not even with a final death. It ends in silence. And that silence is the truest reflection of the galaxy they once served. For in the grim darkness of the far future, nothing ends cleanly. There are no victories without cost, no defeats without echoes, no truths without contradictions. There is only survival, and even survival is a temporary lie. The Imperium continues its endless wars. The High Lords sit upon Terra, their decrees grinding across the stars. The Inquisition watches and burns, its agents pruning away heresy with fire and fear. The Adeptus Astartes fight their ceaseless crusades, each chapter believing itself eternal, each one blind to how easily eternity can shatter. In this endless machinery, the lost chapter is gone. Their banners are ash. Their fortress is dust. Their records are struck from every archive. Officially, they never existed. Yet, despite the will of the Imperium, they remain. Their silence lingers. It haunts the battlefield where refugees whisper of nameless angels who once came to their aid. It echoes in the shrieks of chaos cults who proclaim their fall as proof of the god's supremacy. It stirs in the sermons of desperate priests who promise that when the galaxy burns its brightest, the forgotten warriors will return. Even in the black libraries of Xenos seers, their shadow is noted, a fragment of inevitability carved into the flow of fate. They are gone, and yet they are everywhere. This is their curse. To be erased is to be freed from truth, but to be remembered in myth is to live forever without form. The chapter has become a mirror, and in that mirror the galaxy sees itself, broken, desperate, contradictory. To the Imperium they are a warning, to chaos a promise, to mortals a prophecy, to themselves perhaps nothing at all. But that nothing is what gives their silence its power. For silence cannot be killed. And so the chapter lives on in a way that no loyal warrior would ever choose, but that no enemy can ever destroy. They are no longer men. They are not even traitors or heroes. They are a scar across history, a shadow that lengthens with every retelling. When the Orks gather for their next great whack, someone will speak of the angels who once fell. When the Necrons rise in another tomb world, someone will whisper of the warriors who vanished. When the Great Rift swallows another sector whole, the myths will flare again, painted across the void by terrified mortals. The chapter will never return, and yet they will never leave. Perhaps that is the truest horror of their fate. Death at least is an ending. Damnation at least is a destiny. But the lost chapter has neither. They are trapped in the endless churn of Warhammer's grim reality, where history and myth feed each other until no one can tell the difference. They are an eternal cycle, repeating across centuries, their silence shaping the galaxy as surely as words ever could. This is the nature of the Imperium. This is the nature of chaos. This is the nature of the 41st millennium itself. The galaxy does not care for truth. It cares only for survival, for stories that give mortals reason to fight another day, for myths that keep the machinery turning even as it devours the flesh of those who serve it. In such a place, silence is more powerful than speech, and myth more enduring than life. The lost chapter is proof of this eternal truth. They will never be known by their true name again. Their oaths, their victories, their brotherhood, all of it is gone. But their silence remains, shaping the future in ways they themselves never intended. They are gone and they are eternal. They are erased and they are infinite. They are forgotten and they are remembered forever. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, perhaps that is the only kind of immortality that truly exists.